Okay, so I wanted to do a video of possibly what has been one of the most influential how-to type of books in, I think, my creative career. So I say this with a little bit of trepidation in that I hope I do it justice. And dare I say it, the abuse that the book has taken, which is Understanding Comics, The Invisible Art, by Scott McCloud. And I think, in case you're wondering, I'm not in any way a graphic or comic artist. So, of course, read this book if you're aspiring to quite literally make comics. But I would strongly make a case that this book is just incredibly powerful in deconstructing how we present ideas, how we communicate, both visually, through text, and through evoking all manner of other emotions and things through those media or medium. So I thought I'd basically sort of just go through a little bit some of the highlights, but of course skip to the second one if you're wanting to get into the detail. But I would say even for people who are just trying to work in any form of industry that communicates ideas that are not totally understood and obvious, and even if they are, I think this book will still add insight and layers of how to do things more simply. So, kicking off. Essentially, he does a really good job of just essentially understanding the origins and the history of how visual sort of, depictions and the necessity for them as we move from an oral history type of culture into something that had the ability to accurately depict things. So I think, dare I say it, you can skip through the history lesson if you like, but it adds a huge amount of understanding as to why, the line on paper has been so powerful to our culture and civilization as a whole. And dare I say it, I think it's one of those things that you don't often get taught at school at this level of granularity, why things even happened, and taking sometimes a reframing of things, whether it's sort of humor or political satire, all those things still have quite a complex history, which he does an incredible job of deconstructing and making it very accessible to understand, as you can see the sort of progression. And indeed, layering on things like the technical sort of things from printing machinery that were available at the time. I mean, art and science have always gone hand in hand, and it's that fascinating thing of that you see artistic leaps also through the technology enabling it, and vice versa. So we can get into that all on a whole nother level. But I think he also spends a lot of time talking about how our brains operate. And I think this is a really lovely example of saying that, this is an American plug socket. It looks a little bit like a face. We just seem to do something with that eyes, mouth, head ratio of geometries. And he makes the point, even if you've ever played this game as a kid, of just drawing random squiggles and someone else trying to sort of make sense of it, either as an animal or a face or a, sort of an object. We just seem to be predisposed to see things. And I mean, cars is a really classic example of, these two eyes and mouth and possibly some suggestion of a nose. I mean, this is just eternal, and you've never seen a car that really breaks from this format successfully, I might add. So there's something almost, dare I say it, slightly unnerving in how much you realize as humans we're a bit predisposed to certain things, and we're really quite unreceptive to breaks from those conventions. So I think, dare I say it, I feel a little bit bad even showing this page. I should maybe try and obscure it. So this is I think possibly one of the most plagiarized pages on comics and visual art I think out there, which I think is just incredible testament to what Scott McCloud had done in this book. And essentially what he's done is just, he's incredible at just putting all the references. He's absolute, incredible craftsman in that respect. But what he's done basically is he said this is the picture plane up here, which is basically very, very geometric, reality in quotes down here, and meaning. And what's interesting is, as you can see, we're getting very realistic pictures, and then they're almost sliding over to things which have a lot more geometric sense, a lot more geometric simplicity rather, and it's really getting about the expression and the meaning here. And I think, you know, if I was going to go to a quick go-to that I'm sure most people can relate to, Tintin and Charlie Brown and Snoopy, there really is not a whole lot of line and sort of sketchy stuff going on. It really is just pretty much the simplest thing you can do without getting into a Stickman XKCD type style of comic. And then, of course, you've got all the sort of traditional art structuring in the past. And then as you're moving up, it's getting away from the reality into the more geometric and kind of quite exaggerated, quite crazy, shapes up here. It's really sort of distorting itself almost to the point of where this is like expressionist and abstractionism. So I think he just does an incredible job of I'll be honest, the first time you look at this, it's kind of overwhelming and it just goes over your head. But by the time you've been through this book and this book, you kind of see the potency of him crafting something like this as a reference material. So what's nice is he breaks down things into sort of moment to moment, action to action, subject to subject, scene to scene, aspect to aspect, and non sequitur. And he uses this as a lens to almost sort of a little bit like when you look at food labeling, like what is the ingredients that make this particular comic the way it is. And I think it's quite, you could say it's a bit academic, but I think it's really interesting that, there is no point comparing Tintin to, say, something from the Marvel comics to sort of really understand that. And when you look at artists or the comic series they produce, you can start to see which things they over-index on, and if there's more of a general spread or even sort of two peaks, giving it a unique flavour. So he goes through this, and I think this is one of these things that it's quite heavy and quite intense, but I'd say it's even one of those things you come back to after reading the book and it really sort of clicks into place. What's happening and why information is staged the way it is. And I think he does a tremendous job of even sort of pointing out how atmosphere is created through different cultures and different artists over time. That, scene setting in a lot of Asian art, very, very important to building up the emotion before it gets into the dialogue. And, you could say that one of the things he makes, which I think I had sort of realized and not really taken the point, is that you see these close-ups. And of course, this feels very cinematic. Even the fact this looks almost, cinematic scape proportions. And I think it makes a really good job of saying, these sorts of specialisms are usually not islands. Art has influenced, comic as much as comics have influenced the screen. And I think he even makes that point that actually the motion blur came as a direct result of cinema, because quite literally things do blur when it's sweeping past the camera. And how to depict that graphically was quite an interesting challenge. You could say rays of light are not intuitive. These are products of glass lenses filming moving pictures. You see that sort of distortion, and yet it's been pulled into a graphic art. So I think if you're into that sort of thing, he does a really great job of just almost making you more visually aware of some of the tricks and the references that we take for granted in everyday society. I jumped ahead. The beginnings of motion blur and things like this. So I think as well he spends a lot of time in essentially not just saying that emotion is just what people say, it's also how they're depicted, and also the sort of line qualities that are used. When you look at R. Crumb's very sort of sketchy, almost at times feeling quite sort of dank and sort of oppressive and depressing. If you've read any of his stuff, it is just that. Fruit of sort of, Kirby's very clean cut, aspirational, America's great kind of vibe going on. And I think it's just one of those things that you really start to dial into what it means to put a certain type of line quality on a page. And even if you're not looking to do something that's as artistic per se, you can still communicate very effectively the emotion through a different style that's particular to you. Again, I think he spends a bit of time also just breaking down things like eye line, positioning, very, very simple cues as to what emotion is going on, and actually sort of builds it out into, you know, quite a lot more about what's happening, as you can see, and how to build into different staging of emotion and communication. And I think he just does a tremendous job. And again, referencing back to this pyramid is incredibly useful as you go through the book for just anchoring ideas. So another thing he covers is again this sort of, you know, a way to sort of deconstruct things from the idea, the form, idiom, structure, craft, and surface, and then essentially sort of showing how these things radiate out. And I think, you know, without getting into the book too much, it's a little bit like saying, well, you know, at the end of the day, it's quite easy to craft a good surface on a comic, but once you bite into it, has it really got these depth and layers, or does it feel hollow? And I appreciate that's obviously a bit of a brutal thing when you're starting out, as he pointed out here, the new kid. I'll just put that a little bit closer. But he's really just saying, you know, look, the new kid on the block can put a shiny apple, but has it necessarily got the old master's depth? And so, again, sort of really just being honest with yourself of when can you get away with that shiny apple, and when do you realize you do need to work on things with a little bit more substance. And I love the fact that even though this is a very graphic, you know, industry that he's going through, I feel when I look at product design, these rules apply exactly the same. Whether you're crafting a marketing message for a product or indeed the product itself. He touches a little bit on color, which again I think is just incredibly useful, even if you don't consider yourself a graphic designer, just how to sometimes know, you know, how to create a sort of color scheme, which is quite simple. And I love the fact he picks out this point of, you know, again, not using too much color or it gets kind of muddy, but it does make you appreciate, oh yeah, that is kind of, you know, Batman's signature colors. Hulk really is about these. And I think you can create iconic references that help people interact with your work much more cleanly and quickly. And I think again what's great is that he spends a lot of time, usually at the end of books, just saying, look, I didn't finish this last chapter, it's the end, go home. He really does spend time trying to also say, how do you find your own way, where do you go next? And so he does a great job always of listing a lot of different things you can go read next. And so I just think it's an incredibly, I mean, you know, huge range of different people who reference this. And again, going on to making comics, I will put this in a second video and we will continue.